nature is part of us. We need the trees. We need the rivers and the lakes. We need all of these other creatures, the beautiful fellow creatures, to live in harmony with us. And we cannot cut the trees and destroy the forest. Where will the animals go? We cannot destroy the wetlands and the swamps. Where would the frogs go? And yet they sing beautifully. So again, we still have a great hope here in Uganda.
Welcome to the Earthkeepers podcast. This podcast is for people who seek new and better ways to love and care for the earth. It's a podcast for anyone who is deeply concerned about the harm being done to the environment on a local and global level. It's a podcast that builds community and connection between people of like heart and mind, people who believe that earth care should be integrated into every aspect of life, and for many in the Earthkeepers community, that includes our spiritual lives. In this episode, I'll be talking to Dr. Edward Olara, a farmer and educator in Uganda. Edward was once a student of mine in the Community Development Program at Northwest University. He is also a friend, and we've worked together in Uganda to encourage and empower development professionals. Among other things, Edward spends his days teaching about sustainable agriculture, community development, and leadership, and modeling earthkeeping practices on his farm in northern Uganda. He is currently working on a book called The Elephant and the Farmer. Welcome, friends, to the Earthkeepers podcast. Thank you so much for being on the podcast. Just to give our listeners a sense of what your life is like, could you tell us about where you live, maybe about your family and about your farm?
Well, thank you, Forrest, for having me. It's a profound honor for me to join in this conversation. Well, for our listeners, once again, my name is Edward Olara, speaking to you from Kampala, Uganda. I am married to a beautiful girl from Oregon, actually. Tillamook, to be specific. That's a county people know as having more cows than people. We have 3 beautiful children. Ethan is 12, Elizabeth 9, and Elias, the little guy, is 4. We live partly in the city of Kampala, where the kids go to school here in an international school. And we also live in Lira, that's my hometown, and that's where our little farm is located. So that's about it.
And what do you have on your farm? Are you raising animals as well as growing vegetables?
Yes. A little bit of everything, including bunnies.
Bunnies, awesome.
Yes.
Now, are you raising bunnies for food, or is that a sensitive question to ask?
I just love to see them bouncing around. for beauty,
so you're
mostly.
a sentimental farmer. Wonderful.
Yes, yes.
Well, hey, I wonder if you could maybe give us a sense of what village life is like day to day.
Oh, yeah, gladly. We actually love it in the village more than in the city. Sometimes I wonder why we're... Then again, the kids have to go to school here.
So you're in Kampala now?
Yes, right at this moment, waiting for the Christmas break. Then we head out. The kids love it there a lot. They look forward to waking up every morning, anticipating to chase the little goats or feed the bunnies, the turkeys, the chicken, or the pigs. And my wife actually loves vegetable gardens. Spends time there watering, weeding, or harvesting those yummy cucumbers and tomatoes. And for me, it's actually my peaceful part of the day to just wake up and sit under a nice, cool shade and think about my book and gather inspiration from nature. I'm actually working on a book, The Elephant and the Farmers. That's the title.
Tell us more about that book.
Oh, yeah, well, I'll do. So depending on the season, we're always busy either planting something or weeding or harvesting or just having water fights during the hot days there. It's beautiful. So the book I got inspired to think about the life of our farmers. And actually, it's not a book about animals, much as I use that figurative animal, the elephant. But the elephant represents many oppressive forces that burden the people here, especially in Uganda and Africa. And a very interesting part of that book, I'm writing actually about climate change and the contribution of nations, especially developed nations. So that's sort of oppression that innocent farmers, innocent people in developed world, in developing countries are actually receiving. So they are receiving the negative, just so to speak. They are receiving that from the sharp end. So it's a very inspiring book. At least it's inspiring me for now. So yeah, that's basically about it. And I talk about the farmers, the local people, and their struggles, day-to-day struggles to make ends meet for their families. And so it brings out some reality of life here, the people. Yeah.
Who do you hope will read this book? Like, what audience do you have in mind when you're writing?
It's actually a broad audience. It tackles many issues that I would love our people here to be aware of, but I also would love those who are concerned about the poor to read that book.
Well, let's come back to the book. Let me try to expand a little bit on Uganda and its role as a nation in Africa. I do also want to say that I miss Uganda. And I'm thinking about driving over the river, passing by the parks. Everything in me wanted to stop and spend days and days.
Yes.
But we had other things to do. Yeah, okay. I'm coming back.
Yes.
Yeah, so it is such a beautiful country. And I remember well your particular farm as well. And that whole region is just so green and lush and fertile. It just was a joy to be there. Let me ask you then about the bigger role of Uganda. I mean, obviously, the country produces a lot of food, and not just for Uganda. I think a lot of countries look to Uganda as a source of their imports.
Yes.
Can you give us a sense of how Uganda fits into that bigger scheme of things, just in terms of their role in producing food for the region?
Well, yeah, absolutely. It's a known fact. Uganda has been described as the food basket of this region, East African region, Central Africa, and it extends actually further out into the other countries in Africa. And almost anything grows here in Uganda, as you witnessed as you were here. We plant vast categories of food crops, cash crops, and we're actually beginning to process some of those and improve quality and get them across the borders. And for a long time now, Uganda has been a major exporter of crops like coffee, tea, cotton, cocoa, fish, milk, and many others to the neighboring countries. And actually now with the East African Federation, we are talking about creating a regional bloc, this time a stronger one with 7 countries. So Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania, Rwanda, Burundi, and South Sudan, and Congo. South Sudan, as you know, is the youngest, one of the youngest countries in Africa. And with this conversation, we're talking about the possibility of using a common currency and a common passport. So that will make trading much easier in this part of the world.
What would be the primary stated function of the bloc? Like, what's the main top, say, 3 reasons for cooperating as a collective?
Trade is one of them, and political federation. Eventually, we hope that we, as the African people, can unite. You know, that is the dream that our forefathers have had for a long time, and now the future generation, we are leaning towards one day creating the United States of Africa. So it's beginning with regional bloc creation, beginning with trade and free movement of people, goods, and services. And eventually we begin to go into the leadership political federation with single center, headquarter, single president, and single army in these regions. And that's not far-fetched, to be optimistic. It's not far-fetched because there's a greater awareness is being created on the continent that it's time for the African people to come together.
Yeah, that's really exciting to hear about. I would imagine that when it comes to, growing crops and such, it might actually help to coordinate with the surrounding countries in this very fertile region to decide who can make what, who can grow what, just in terms of not flooding the market with one product and not growing enough of another. It seems like that kind of coordination would lead to maybe better economics in the long run.
Yes, actually, today I read on the newspaper about the discussion beginning to evolve. Since we're coming together as a larger market now, we begin to talk about who is good at what. And actually, that's the very essence of unity. We come together providing what we're good at creating or growing. In this sense, Uganda agriculture is the mainstay of the economy. And so we can support the rest of the countries with agricultural produce.
Yeah, you had mentioned earlier in passing that Uganda is starting to actually process more of the food that it grows, which also seems economically significant. Can you explain why that's important, that Uganda not export only raw material, but also process goods?
Yes, it's now important that we process and add quality and brand so that actually as we sell, we have an attachment of pride and also to fetch higher prices on these produce and other products that we sell to the rest of the countries. Because for a very long time, as you know, Africa has supported the world, but with raw materials. And oftentimes they are bought very cheaply, if not taken for free. So now we're beginning to say, yes, we're taking a stand here that we need fair trade. So if this fair trade means we process and improve the quality of what we produce, yes. So that is the direction, and there is a will. Just over the radio this morning, China was giving a list of some of the items that they want in the Chinese market from Uganda. And some of those have to be packaged well, processed if need be, before it can be sold to China, because we also need to charge a fair price.
So I've been following your work and the work of other farmers and even politicians in Africa, and I know that one of the issues has to do with this topic you're touching on in terms of raw materials, or maybe more importantly, how food is produced and who actually controls the production. There are, of course, factions in Africa that are really lobbying for an industrial mode of agriculture. So very big farms cultivated with machines and not that many laborers. And so it's kind of a Western model of industrial agriculture that some people say is the future. Other people, and I think you fall into this camp, other people are saying that that is not the direction to go. And one of the reasons that you can say that is you look at, say, American agriculture or Canadian agriculture, and you can see the damage that has been done over the decades as farms have become more industrial. I think damage to culture, damage to families, but certainly damage to ecology, just in terms of what it takes now to grow crops in an industrial mode, just in terms of fertilizers and chemicals and overuse of the soil. So I'm wondering if you could comment on that. I know you have strong opinions about this because I'm honored to say to listeners that you were once a student of mine in the Masters of International Community Development at Northwest University.
Yes.
And
yes,
I
yes.
learned a lot from you. I learned a lot from you in terms of your ideas and And
I'm
really your
flattered.
dreams. You're a super optimistic guy. And so you gave me a lot of hope. But tell me about what you think is the future of African agriculture, and maybe Ugandan in particular. But what is the future, and why should we be aiming at that particular future, which is not the direction of industrial farming?
Well, every time there's need to meet the bottom line, which is usually more profits, more food, the consumerism demand, it puts pressure on everything, especially the environment. And yes, I do believe that we need to slow down a bit. Slow down and rethink the way we are doing things. There has been a major concern, actually, with the farmers here in Uganda about using these modern means to produce more, produce faster, produce better, high yield breed quality of crops or breeds of animals. Put some enhancement to the point that we are losing the organic nature of the food. And food is something that we cannot mess up with. Food has to be organic. And I am proud to say that most of the food that we eat here is still largely organic. There's been a strong resistance to modified crops and food crops rather. So we still take a strong stand on producing organically.
Do you think that Uganda has a future in terms of small-scale farming, organic farming, farms that actually kind of defy the industrial model?
It's not just a matter of the future. We are already living in that future. But we are scared that that perfect world is being infiltrated by profit-oriented corporations and middlemen. And much as I talked about the need to supply to the market what we produce, but that is also appealing so much to the farmers that they are leaning towards finding ways of increasing the quantity of what they produce. And with that comes the risk of messing up what is original, what is ecological, what is natural. Then we overwork the land, or we do away with the forest so we can grow some more of sugar cane or tea or coffee. And that has been some of the issues we are dealing with here currently.
So you are someone who is speaking up for a different way forward and acting really in resistance to especially the large corporations that want to buy up land and mass produce food. I'm wondering, are you feeling alone in that? Do you have others around you who are also speaking up for that model? And I guess on the flip side, what's going on in terms of government support for that particular model? Are they actually factoring in as a force that is changing the future for the good?
True. I'm not alone. You're with me and a few others.
Yes, I am, brother.
And a few others here.
Yeah.
The voice of reason is present and strong on the continent. Actually, it's gaining momentum on the continent, on the issues that we must hold so dear, and to fight and resist whatever is coming to ruin or whatever has already been actually putting the African people on the receiving end. We're not just receiving foreign aid, but we're also receiving some of these ideas that are very detrimental to us as a people, to our culture but now to the environment, let alone to our natural resources that have been exploited for all these centuries.
And of course, you're referring to a lot of the damage done in colonial years by countries, as you say, exploiting, taking resources for free, doing damage. How much damage did Uganda come out of that period with? And has it been hard to recover? I mean, it's still a process, isn't it? Because you're trying to find your own way assert your own rights as a people. But I'm wondering how much of a weight on that process comes from the legacy of colonial influence.
It won't be solved in this decade or even the next, but there is hope that one day Africa will be free. Free indeed, free and independent to take a stand over the economic issues and political issues. Free to say that we are a people and we also deserve to be listened to by the rest of the world. And it will take time, but I must say that a lot is changing. In the recent years, a lot has changed in Africa.
I want to ask you about some of the roles that you're playing. I mean, obviously, you've got a great farm going, but I wonder what else you are doing in terms of educating people about better farming practices and such. I know, too, that you teach people about not only community development, but also speak about climate change, that you try to make people aware of the costs of climate change. And I'm wondering, can you tell us about those different contexts in which you speak and teach and influence?
Oh, yeah. Well, I am always fascinated by new ideas and the need to keep learning as much as I possibly can, in order to join the rest of my fellow African scholars and practitioners in the effort of making life better for our people. Well, after I graduated from Northwest University, I learned at your feet, Forrest, and I will forever be indebted. I went on to do a doctoral studies in leadership, actually with a specific thesis on servant leadership in a patriarchal society. I have always felt that my home, Africa, is the best place for me to be. That is where I am relevant. That is where I am needed. That's where I can make a contribution. I teach in 2 different universities here. One of those interesting courses that I teach is smart farming and modern food systems. And I teach community development as well. I teach public-private partnership in providing services and infrastructure development in the country, among other courses, including research development. So I still feel that this is the time to recruit as many African young minds as possible and help them to join this movement of bringing transformation and to stand for our communities.
How's that going? Do you feel like people are responsive? That in
Yes.
fact it really is a movement, that people are joining with some excitement about change?
Yes. There is great energy building at different levels, even with the local farmers at the grassroots. They are yearning for new ideas. And every time you share something, they listen to it and then they catch it. What I do in the village basically is to model some of the best practices.
Tell me about how Ugandans look at climate change, at needing to find more sustainable ways of living with the earth. Would you say that most people have a sensibility of earthkeeping or earth care, or is that something that's really emerging as well? I ask this question because I know that oftentimes with people who are poor, profit in providing for their family, that's the primary motive. It's hard to think about things like the health of the ecology. But I'm wondering, what kind of balance do you see happening with Ugandan farmers in particular? Do they have both in their mind when they think about farming well?
Well, to a greater majority of people in Uganda, climate change is a new phenomenon. And it's something they don't understand. But in recent times, climate change has raised very serious concerns to the farmers. For instance, there's been very unusual temperature rise and prolonged drought. The local farmers have always been naive about climate change, but now they're beginning to realize there's something really wrong. And I actually address this part in my book as well. But not until the past few years, though, that there have been notable changes in the rain and the dry seasons. The drought or the dry spell is prolonged. The farmers miss out on the critical seasons to plant or to harvest. And I live among the farmers in the countryside most of the time, and I begin to hear them as they're talking. Then I'm like, oh, okay. So this is now pinching. I hear them lamenting about how the seasons have been bad, how it's been so hot, how the rain has not been there for months and months. So yes, it is beginning to wake people up. But again, it's like you are waking somebody up and who doesn't know, who is not responsible for what is happening. But somewhere, somehow, the problem is impacting everybody here. But where is this coming from? Who is responsible for this climate change that now innocent people are beginning to suffer the consequences for what they have not done? They may have contributed a little bit, but that percentage is very small as I was reading or researching about it. Our contribution to global warming is small. And innocent farmers don't understand. But now they are receiving the consequences, which is actually the bigger problem here.
Which I suppose on some level makes them very receptive to learning about climate change, because
Yes.
they see it with their own eyes and they just need people to put the reasons behind it.
Yes.
As we speak, the COP27 discussion conference on the environment is happening, and one of the top issues that developing nations are trying to keep on the agenda has to do with reparations, has to do with money to help countries like Uganda to adapt to future climate change. And of course, that money would be compensation from wealthier nations that in great part have been the cause of global warming. I'm wondering how people feel about it. Are people aware of that sort of global level discussion about reparations? I want to know what you think as well. Just how likely is it, do you think, that wealthier nations are going to kind of pay their fair share for the damage done already and for the damage that's yet to come in developing countries in particular?
Well, yes, this is the information and news that is still limited to a few people. I am aware that most, especially the elites, are aware about this development. But other people just, when they hear about that, they just think of it as another conference about world issues. I think when it gets down to the people in Uganda, they would fall headlong into the idea of receiving compensation for the environmental damages caused by developed nations. Of course, they must take responsibility, as we mentioned earlier. But in my view, I think compensation does not solve the grand problem. And we can hold as many conferences as we want, but if the discourses are not followed by actions, these conferences will remain a thing of sugarcoating our conscience, if you will. But of course, there is need for restitution for the damages caused to the environment. But again, I think it's the environment itself to be compensated. The very tenets of sustainability, not the people. Because if this money is given to governments, given to people, it will be misused or misdirected to something that does not even concern the environment. I would be completely on board with that idea if it's coming in terms of the regeneration of creation, the establishment of clean energy sources, maybe planting of trees or cleaning the dumping sites, etc. That would be a proper way of taking responsibility. And better still, these developed nations could embrace the will to stop producing these greenhouse gases altogether.
Clearly, Uganda has a lot of areas set aside, just in terms of protection. I'm wondering if you could talk about the forests as well, because I know that is an issue too. There is that tension between, the need of people to live and the need to preserve bastions of ecological health. And those two things are often in tension. But are there ways that, in fact, we could do both in a way that, to use that word that you and I know, copower one another?
Oh, yeah.
So that people could thrive even as they were protecting the land and defending the ecology?
Our ancestors did not need to worry about these issues we're talking about today because they lived in harmony with the environment. They hunted and only got what they needed for food. They fished just for food. And they did not destroy the forest because they knew trees were part of the spiritual connection to nature. So, but again, today we're slowly losing that sense. It is a lot more worse in other parts of the world that people no longer have connections to nature. But here we still have hope because nature is part of us. We need the trees. We need the rivers and the lakes. We need all of these other creatures, the beautiful fellow creatures, to live in harmony with us. And we cannot cut the trees and destroy the forest. Where will the animals go? We cannot destroy the wetlands and the swamps. Where would the frogs go? And yet they sing beautifully. So again, we still have a great hope here in Uganda. We have forests. Actually, we have national forests that nobody is allowed to encroach. We have beautiful rivers and lakes that is feeding the country. So all we need now is the will to protect nature, to protect that which we have, because we cannot afford losing. We cannot lose all of these magnificent forests that we have here in Uganda just because we want to make profit. And then all of a sudden we become a desert. What would we be doing to our children? Nobody wants to leave a world behind without trees for the children to climb, or rivers so that kids can swim in, or forests that can provide that beautiful breathe for our kids. No, nobody wants to do that. So we need to wake up our conscience to our actions.
We on the podcast emphasize the idea, the practice of listening to difference in order to learn and change and be transformed. So, for example, we often feature or highlight voices who are making the case that the world as a whole needs to learn from indigenous ways of being, ways of thinking, in particular in relationship to living well with nature, living well on the earth. Some of what you're saying has the ring of so many of the indigenous folks who are speaking to us. Is that the case in Uganda, that people are still close enough to indigenous ways of living that some of those values are still at work and could even be magnified to the rest of Uganda and ultimately to the world? What does Uganda, maybe Ugandan history, especially of indigenous people, have to say to the world in terms of how we need to live with nature?
One of our biggest treasures here is social capital. We treasure our fellow human beings because we cannot live in isolation. No one can live in isolation. Actually, that has been honed by the age-old African philosophy of ubuntu, that I am because you are because I am. So together, me looking after you, you looking after me. Whatever I do can impact you, good or bad. So again, then that makes us live in consciousness of our actions towards not only our fellow human beings, but also the environment and nature in general. And then we have this consciousness which has been captured within the ideal of sankofa. Sankofa is an ideal that calls us, wakes us up to go back, think about the past. How did we live? How did we act? How did we connect with our fellow human beings, with the environment, so that we can gain wisdom from the past in order to continue forward into the future? So, and I think the past has many things to teach us, issues of just slowing down a bit. And of course, when you come here, you will appreciate the phenomenon of slowing down and remove your watch and turn off your cell phone and just take a walk into the woods and just wave to the monkeys.
When you mentioned that, part of living slow is to take a walk in the forest and look at the monkeys. I did try taking a walk in the forest in Uganda, but the whole time I was afraid of the monkeys. That's all I could think about. It was definitely not a peaceful moment for me.
Well,
I think I could get used to monkeys, I guess, eventually, but they're kind of bigger than squirrels, which is what I'm used to.
try the birds.
Okay. Yeah, start with the birds. Yeah. Well, you know what you're talking about in terms of the Ugandan connections to nature, especially these connections that are rooted in history and historical values. There seems to me to be an element of spirit in it. And I'm wondering, let's talk about you. When you talk about your relationship with nature, what does that have to do with anything spiritual? How does that connect to your spiritual life?
Thank you. Well, the time I feel more spiritual is not even when I'm in church, but it's when I am alone in the quietness and the tranquil of the forest, maybe in my garden, in my farm, early in the morning when the birds are singing. Oh, I should have shared this. When I started creating my farm, planting all kinds of trees, shade trees, planted an orchard, planted flowers. For the first time in many years as I lived in that village, that I began to receive nature. I began to receive birds, began to receive other creatures that I don't even know their names. The birds sometimes come to my doorstep, and I'm amazed at this. They are on the flowers, they are on the trees, and this is awesome. That is the time I feel I am connected, that sense of peacefulness, that sense of feeling that I am here and I am part of something bigger. I am part of creation. I am part of the universe. That is so amazing and so phenomenal that we can't even comprehend. But here is me. What a privilege for me to be alive, let alone to be born at all. And so I must think beyond some of the dogmas, think beyond some of the human structures, think beyond even religion itself, to be able to make sense of life and make sense of the entire creation. And how can I live meaningfully? How can I make a contribution to nature, to the environment, to all of this? I should not be a problem. I should not be causing harm, because when I cause harm to anything around me, I'm causing harm to myself. We are not in isolation as human beings. We are just part of this grand creation. And so we cannot stand at the top and then fail to be conscious that your next door neighbor, that worm or that butterfly is part of the community.
I think what I hear you arguing for is a shift in mindset, even a shift in values, perhaps even a shift in spirituality. That connection is a premise for change. Unless we realize who we are in relation to the rest of the world and have a right conception of where we belong and how we're responsible to our relatives, unless we do that, I'm not sure really that any substantial change can happen. What do you think about that?
Yes, mindset is the biggest thing, actually. And it comes from somebody embracing new views about life and rethinking the whole thing. Then you emancipate yourself. I think for my friends in the developed nations, it is still possible. It is possible because then you decide as an individual that this is how I want to live. I have a few people that I know, even in the United States of America, who have decided, who are walking this path. And they're happier than before. They're happy. Maybe you should walk some more. Don't buy another big truck because your neighbor has done so. Just stop keeping up and live simply so that you can enjoy this life with nature. This life is very short, but sometimes we behave as if we live forever. This is when I think about people who are accumulating wealth at the expense of other people, even on the blood of other people, or at the damage of the environment. Where are you going to take this wealth in your short life? The main thing here would be to just enjoy yourself in the process as you help other people to enjoy theirs too, not just human beings, but the squirrels too.
So really you're advocating that all of us just need to slow down and stop and smell the monkeys, right?
Yes. But not for your case. You don't like the monkeys.
We've been in conversation with Dr. Edward Olara, a practitioner scholar in Uganda. For more information about things we've talked about in this episode, please go to the show notes on the podcast webpage. If you appreciate this podcast and want to help us expand its global reach, please show your support by subscribing. Just go to whatever platform you listen to podcasts on and hit the subscribe or follow button for the Earthkeepers podcast. I'm Forrest Inslee, your podcast host. Our executive producer is James Amadon. Our producer is Dave Wolfers. Timothy Connor is our editor, and Forrest Reed is the creator of our original music. Our research assistant is Rochelle Nordman, and Jesselyn Gentry is our social media director. Thank you, friends, for listening, and please join us for our next conversation on the Earthkeepers podcast.